All right, welcome back everybody. I'm Mark Davis here at St. Mark Presbyterian Church, and we are looking at creation stories during this month of June. If you have any questions about our videos, our discussions, our worship services, you can contact us here. And as you can see, we're now on the third edition of these creation stories. We looked at Genesis 1. Last week we looked at Genesis 2. Today we're continuing that story and looking at Genesis chapter 3, which I'm calling, with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, Paradise Lost, because we'll talk about Milton's role in our interpretation of this story as we go along. The third chapter of Genesis is one of the most cited and studied and overanalyzed and represented, perhaps misrepresented, stories in the Old Testament. It shows up a lot, and really in some respects out of proportion to the role it actually plays in the Old Testament. We'll look at that in a minute. So what I want to do is start by just kind of walking through the story with you. There's a lot there. There are a lot of assumptions. There are a lot of things that are taken for granted. And it's an intriguing story, no doubt, that leaves itself open to a million different interpretations. So we're going to try to stay with the core story itself. And it begins with, imagine this, a talking serpent, and apparently a walking serpent. So without any apology, without any explanation, there was nothing in the second chapter of creation that tells us animals talked, that they were smart, that they were able to argue and interact with humans. But there's nothing in Eve's response to the serpent that indicates that for her this was anything unusual. So this is a story, and you have to take the story as it's given to us. If I were telling the story, I don't have talking snakes. But a lot of ancient myths do. So it starts with a talking serpent, not Satan, a talking serpent, never called Satan in this story. And the serpent begins with what looked like a question. Did God say you can't eat any tree in the garden? Speaking to the woman. I'm going to refer to her as Eve throughout this stuff, this video and on these slides. Let's be aware that it's not until very late in this story that she's actually named Eve, and Adam and Eve become more or less proper names for the man and the woman. Initially in the story, they're just called the woman and the man, but that's a bit of a mouthful, and I'm just going to take shortcuts and call them Adam and Eve, with your permission. So the serpent says to Eve, did God say you can't eat of any tree in the garden? And it's represented in our scriptures as a question. The question mark is not in the Hebrew text, so that's an interpretation. It could be a leading statement. God said you can't eat of any tree in the garden. So that's what the serpent says. And the serpent's identified, again, not as Satan, but as being more crafty than any of the other animals in the garden. So it's an animal. It's a talking animal. I give you that. It's a walking animal, that phrase. It's a crafty animal, but it's an animal. And Eve responds, and again, she doesn't respond by saying, talking snake. She says, no, you're wrong. God didn't say we can't eat of any tree, just not this one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, bear in mind that in the second chapter, when God planted the garden, and then God created the human, and then God said, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that prohibition was given before Eve was created. So her correction to the snake, the serpent, is at this point hearsay that she got from Adam, and it's a little amplified too. God didn't just say you can't eat from it, God said you can't touch it, right? So now it's become almost a little more of a prohibition someone might say a dare. But if we call it a dare, now we're preaching. So Eve corrects the serpent, but then she looks at the tree and had two reactions. Number one, saw its beauty. Now remember, in the creation story in Genesis chapter 2, beauty is one of the marks of the garden. It's a good thing. She saw it was beautiful, and that it was desired for wisdom. So there's a passive language there. It was desired for wisdom. That's kind of a new thing here in the human story, is desire. Let's talk about that on Wednesday, because desire seems to be part of a spectrum from need to want to desire to avarice. You know, I think there's a spectrum there with some very thin lines between them. She saw the fruit was desired to make one wise, and so she ate it. And having eaten it, she gave it to Adam, who at least at that point was standing right there, and he ate it. So they both ate it. He didn't push back and say, no, we're not supposed to eat that. It doesn't say that she didn't tell him where it came from, and she sneaked over to where he was and said, oh, look, here's some fruit, have some. Adam is not depicted as having been deceived in this story. So Eve and Adam eat of the tree that they're not supposed to eat, and you know what happens is, to some extent, the serpent was correct. They now have the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent said that the reason God prohibited the tree was because if eating it, they would be like God, and that's something with which God will agree later. They have become like us. They will know good and evil. But the serpent's words are a little bit misleading too, because in addition to knowing good and evil, they now know vulnerability. Because when they eat, they realize that they are naked. And that's something about the human being that's not true of any other animal that we know of, that we require artificial clothing to help us survive and to cover our nakedness. We know shame. This is not a point that I want to say is, wonderful, hasn't always been applied well. But in this story, they realize two things. One is their nakedness, or I think a way of reading that is their vulnerability. And number two, they have some shame. And we know that because the very next scene. In the next scene, God comes walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. That's an odd thing, isn't it? In the first creation story, God is just really distant and powerful, and God speaks, and light and darkness come into being. God speaks, and this happens, God speaks, and God claims it good. In the second creation story, God is making things with God's hands. God has hands. And in this story, God is walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, which is what kings would do. It's what people would do if they're near a nice, lush garden, and enjoy the evening breezes and so forth. That's what God is doing. So, where in the first story, God creates man and woman, humans, in God's image, so they are theomorphized to some extent. In the second story, God walks in the garden in the cool of the evening, so God is anthropomorphized to some extent. Just like the snake who can talk and walk, right? Anthropomorphic imagery of both the snake and God in this story, which is very different from the first creation story. So God walks, the humans hide, which is what one would think it indicates an amount of shame. God asked that heartbreaking question, Adam, where are you? So now we've got a God who's not all-knowing, not all-seeing, and not all-wise. A God who walks in the garden in the cool of the evening and doesn't know where Adam is, even though Adam is within earshot. Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I'm here, I'm hiding because I'm naked. And God said, how do you know you're naked? Did you eat the tree from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so now they're busted, right? And busted because they're exhibiting shame in the presence of God. And then the blame game starts. Adam points to Eve and says, the woman. But not just blaming Eve, the woman that you gave me. She gave me the fruit, and I ate. So explicitly, Adam is blaming Eve for giving him the fruit. Implicitly, Adam is blaming God, like, oh, you call this an appropriate helper, a companion for me? This was your idea, God. You're the one who put me to sleep and made this thing, right? So there's blaming that happens where Adam tries to push it off on Eve and implicitly on God. And then God asks Eve, what did you do? And Eve turns around and blames the serpent. The serpent told me to eat it. The serpent was the one. And also perhaps implicitly blaming God, who made this talking creature that's crafty in the first place. God does not ask the serpent, what did you do? And at least one biblical commentator feels like, because the serpent could very easily look at God and say, I told him the truth. That's an interpretation that I just want to leave you with, because I hope it troubles you to read the story a little more closely. So what happens then after the blame game is that God curses them in reverse order, starting with the serpent, then Eve, then Adam. And the serpent now has to slither on the ground. And then we get to verse 15. We'll discuss this on Wednesday, okay? We'll discuss this on Wednesday, but verse 15 looks like a promise that the woman's seed will crush the serpent's head, and the serpent will bite the seed's heel, actually in reverse order, and that's an interesting thing happening in Genesis 3:15. Let's talk about that on Wednesday. I want you to look at it and ruminate on it before then. But that's the serpent. Now he has to slither, and he's going to be in trouble one day. And then the woman, her consequence, as it were, I don't know if this is a curse, but the consequence is that now she will bear children with great pain. Another thing we'll discuss on Wednesday, Adam's consequence is that now he will till the earth with great toil and the sweat of his brow. Because one other thing that happens that we'll look at more this weekend in worship is that the ground itself is caught up in the consequences of this action. And now there are thorns, thistles, and briars to deal with. So you have God walking, humans hiding, the confession, the blame, the consequences, or the curses they're sometimes called. There's that promise in 3:15 that's intriguing. And then they're going to be expelled from the garden because there's still that tree of life there. And this is where God says something really uncharacteristic to this story, but interesting. God says, now they have eaten of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and they have become like us. So God using that us language to refer to God's self. Some people would say this is a sign that there's a Trinity and God's talking to Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Other people would say, look at Psalm 82. God's talking to the divine council. We'll leave that up in the air for the moment, but God says they've become like us. Now, if they stay here in the garden and eat from the tree of life, they'll be stuck this way. And we're not real. It's not, the story doesn't go into detail as to what that scenario might look like. But God doesn't want that to happen, and as an act of perhaps not punishment, but mercy, God expels them from the garden so that they will never eat from the tree of life and have to live, forever in that state. And there's even that, again, surprising language that God put cherubim and a flaming sword there to protect it, as God, the tree of life, as God expels them from the garden. But in the middle of all of that, God also does something else, which one could see perhaps as an act of mercy, is that God makes skins for covering for Adam and Eve, clothes. And, whether this is a story that is intended to explain why it is, the origins of why it is that humans wear clothes and no other animal does, or whether this is somebody's sense of modesty, propriety, even shame about the human body. It's hard to read, it's hard to tell. It simply happens in the story. God makes clothes, garments for them from skins. So this is the first kind of indication we have of the killing of animals in order to serve a human need. Up until now, everybody seems to be vegetarian and getting along swell. All right, that's the story, and I hope I've left enough of it out for you to be intrigued enough to go back and read it closely so you can tell me what I missed. And I hope I've raised some questions for you as you read it from now on. So as I mentioned, Genesis 3 is a chapter that's just treated throughout the history of Judaism and Christianity and the Quran in Islam. Walter Brueggemann, who's one of the foremost Old Testament professors or scholars in the U.S. and a really powerful speaker, Brueggemann warns us in his Genesis commentary of 5 things, and he invites us not to imagine these are true, right? Number 1, people often think that this story in Genesis 3 will now be the touchstone, the archetype for every time somebody screws up, every time someone disobeys, every time someone falls, every time someone radically turns from God. And it's not. It's not the case in Genesis 4, when you have the first murder. It's not the case in Genesis 5, when you have another murder. It's not in the case in the Noah story. None of them, and these very same writers have a lot to do with these stories, but none of them goes back to it, just like Adam and Eve. Here we go, living out the consequence of the garden. They don't do that. So it doesn't become a central story to these biblical storytellers. It will later, especially in the Christian tradition, but not by these same storytellers. It's a marginal story. It happens, they move on to other things. In fact, we'll look Wednesday at how chapter 4 becomes more of an archetype of sinfulness than chapter 3, okay? Well, for later texts. But for now, Brueggemann wants you to know that if you read the Hebrew Bible, nobody keeps pointing back to Genesis chapter 3 and saying, this is the problem. It's all Adam and Eve's fault, okay? Brueggemann argues that there's nothing in this story or what follows that describes this as the fall, that's language that we often use, but probably is inappropriate. He says this is not about the origin of evil, or at least the other texts don't treat it that way. Remember, that's what he's addressing here. How do the other texts in the Old Testament treat this story, especially those texts in Genesis, Exodus, that these same writers wrote? How do they treat the story? They don't treat it as the origin of evil. They don't treat it as the origin of death. They don't treat it as being about sin or sexual sin, about sex or sexual sin. So all of those little ideas about the snake being not a snake or the fruit being not a fruit, have fun with that if you want, but that's not what the biblical writers do, the ones who wrote this story in the first place. That's not how they're seeing it, and there's no warrant for making that claim. So take a picture of this slide if you want, because these are 5 things that Walter Brueggemann cautions us against, and they're very common. Very common. Okay, so let's look at, beyond the Old Testament, how is Adam treated in the New Testament? We'll talk about Eve a little bit as well. So first of all, you take Paul's letters. These are the earliest writings we have in the New Testament. And in Romans chapter 5, Paul treats Adam, not Eve, but Adam, almost like an archetype, beginning with these words: therefore, just as sin came into the world through the one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all because all have sinned. So Paul is saying what Walter Brueggemann said the Hebrew writers don't say. He is saying that this is the beginning of sin, and that is the beginning of death in Romans chapter 5. But Paul seems to be using Adam more as an archetype than a literal figure, because he keeps referring to him as the one man, and later he'll use that very same language to refer to Jesus Christ as the one man. So he'll say, just as sin came into the world through the one man, so salvation much more surely comes into the world through the other man, Jesus Christ. So it's more like Adam and sin and Jesus, that Jesus is the second Adam, that Adam is a type and Jesus is the greater. This is the space where Paul is using that phrase much more surely, to say that what Jesus does, the salvation that Jesus accomplishes, as real as sin might be, salvation is much more surely real for us. So Paul does see Adam either literally or, I would argue, as an archetype, that through this story we see the introduction of sin, but through the story of Christ we see the much greater introduction of salvation. In 1 Corinthians 13, or 15 rather, again, Adam is something like an archetype with the Christ. Paul says, thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, that would be Jesus Christ, became a life-giving spirit. So again, more or less positing Adam in order to posit the salvific work of Christ. That seems to be how Paul looks at Adam. And but notice that he's talking about the trespass and the sin that's brought into the world as Adam, not Eve. Adam, not Eve. Now Paul will make a reference to Eve in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He says, I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thought will be led away from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So basically just taking the story and using it as a moral tale about don't fall into the same deception as Eve did. But he's not pointing to Eve as bringing sin into the world. He does point to Adam that way, mostly as an archetype over and against the second Adam of the Christ. So that's Paul's writing, okay? And now you also have the First Corinthians, that letter of 1 Corinthians, that is attributed to Paul. I cannot say this enough, but Paul did not write this letter. Paul did not write this letter. This letter is contrary to the theology of Paul that we see in Paul's authentic letters. It's much later in the tradition, and it's not Pauline, because this person does blame Eve, and blames her really hard. He says, let a woman learn in silence and with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She's to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and with love and holiness and with modesty. Now, this person takes a much different approach toward the Adam and Eve story than Paul. And this is kind of the genesis of Eve blaming. There's actually some texts earlier that start to do that as well, that are not in our Bible. So there is reference in the New Testament. There's a reference in Jude. Jude only has one chapter. In the 14th verse, there's something interesting. Jude makes a comment about Enoch, who he says is the seventh generation from Adam. So there's a little bit of genealogy there. But notice, then he goes on to talk about Enoch in terms that are not in the Old Testament that we know. They're in the intertestamental literature that was written in between the Old and New Testament. And that gives us an indication that one thing that informs the New Testament writers is not just the Old Testament, but it's also that intertestamental literature. And we will look at that very closely on Wednesday, how some of that has happened. There are 3 references in the Gospels to Adam or Adam and Eve. And the first is in Luke's genealogy. He traces the birth of Jesus back to Adam, who was the Son of God. And in Matthew's genealogy, he only goes back as far as Abraham. So you have that. That's in Luke chapter 3. And then in Matthew 19 and in Mark chapter 6, the same story in parallel fashion. Jesus is asked about divorce and remarriage. And Jesus goes back to the Adam and Eve story, the second creation story, Genesis chapter 2, which you might remember concluded with, therefore a man shall leave his mother and father and cling to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's what Jesus cites, talking about divorce and remarriage. Not talking about same-sex marriage or anything like that. Talking about divorce and remarriage. And that's the only reference we get from Jesus in his teaching to Adam and Eve, and he doesn't refer to the 3rd chapter as the origin of evil. Okay, so on Wednesday, we are going to look at different spaces where we can start to see how the story told in Genesis chapter 3 starts to develop into various traditions. We're going to look at how it starts within the story itself. We're going to look at the prophet Ezekiel and what he does with that. We're going to look at the intertestamental period with 2nd Esdras. And then after the New Testament time, we're going to look at what's happened to this story through Augustine, through the Westminster Shorter Catechism. That's one of the teaching tools in our Book of Confessions in the Presbyterian Church, and in a Puritan learning book that came shortly after that. And we'll look at what happens in Milton's Paradise Lost, that book itself. Okay, we'll save all that for Wednesday. So here's the big question, though. It's an interpretive question. And I want to ask it in 3 different forms. I want you to see the difference. Do Genesis 2, maybe this should say, does Genesis 2 or Genesis 3 describe the essential human condition? So this came up yesterday in a meeting after church. A group of us were talking, and someone was saying, I don't know if that's how we're born or if that's just something I learned along the way. We ask those kinds of questions, right? What is the essential human disposition? Is it innocence, like you see in chapter 2, or is it deception and fall, or deception and disobedience, however you want to describe what we see in Genesis chapter 3? Does Genesis chapter 2 or does Genesis chapter 3 describe the essential human condition? Another, you could ask this question: do Genesis 2 or Genesis 3 describe the essential human condition? I mean, if your answer is no, then we don't have to parse through all this stuff, right? You can say, no, that's not what they're up to. They're doing something else. I think Brueggemann's warning was that while Paul may be doing some of this, this is not what the writers of Genesis 2 and 3 are doing. They have no intention of describing the essential human condition. The other way you could phrase that question is, does Genesis 2 and 3 together describe the essential human condition? We're both lovely made, ground-bearing, God-breathing people, and people prone to deception and desire and disobedience. So I'm trying to shape that question in a number of different ways because I think that they're all kind of important. But even the way we shape the question, I think, says something about how we're reading the text. So, what have I done? I've walked through the text. I've started walking through the traditions around the text. We'll do a lot more of that on Wednesday. But we certainly have looked at some of the warnings that we get from Walter Brueggemann that when we make assumptions about this text, we are normally going beyond what the writers themselves were willing to say. And I think that's really, really important. Okay? So we're leaving a lot on the table for Wednesday, but this is a really, really full text, and that's what we're going to have to do. I hope to see as many of you as I can then. Okay? Thanks. Bye.